I tend to be able to pick up on whether somebody is approaching burnout before they're approaching it themselves or before they notice it. So that has been a really useful thing because it also has helped me figure out when I'm approaching burnout as well.
I was going to say, I wish I had that skill set sometimes. Hey everyone, welcome to Dev Interrupted. I'm your host, Connor Bronston, and today I'm joined by Kelly Vaughn. She is an incredible engineering leader, a mentor, an entrepreneur, and a manager at Spot AI. Kelly, welcome so much to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks for taking me out of my my podcasting retirement, actually.
Honestly, that I was going to mention that next. I didn't say it in the intro, but you are an incredible podcaster. I've listened to the Ladybug podcast for, I guess, 2 years now almost. Huge fan of the show, and I miss it. Are we going to get a new season?
I'll have to talk to the other Ladybugs to see how we feel about that.
Okay.
We all have a lot going on in our lives, as probably everyone does, but I do miss it.
I mean, I'll say as an avid listener myself, I'd accept a one-off episode.
The reunion episode.
Yeah, see, I think people listen. Well, I guess I was going to say I'd be remiss if I didn't give you a shout out for the podcast, but I'm clearly doing that here since I'm a personal fan. It's how we got you on here. I've been following you for a while. There aren't enough great podcasts out there for engineers. If you haven't listened to it, they've got a great back catalog. And we're obviously a growing podcast here at Dev Interrupted, focused more on the engineering leadership angle, particularly. Do you have any advice for us on how to keep our audience engaged or to think about storytelling?
I think one of the biggest mistakes I see podcast hosts do is they ask a question, they get an answer, and then they immediately talk about their own lives and how it relates to their own lives. The podcast episode, if you have a guest on the episode, the focus needs to be on the guest. And that's not just because I want to talk about myself, because we're going to do that, plenty of that today. But that's just generally something I see. And then just authenticity is it's very clear when you're recording a podcast just for the sake of getting some certain buzzwords out there or something like that. You know, pull in real events, like real, we all screw up. I don't know what kind of language I can use on this. So we all make mistakes throughout our careers, and it's really important to normalize that. And I find the more that we pull in like those times that we've messed up somewhere, the episode's much more appealing because the host and the guest are much more relatable.
So I'm curious, this is interesting because host relation to guest is obviously important, but taking over the episode to tell their own stories is a negative. I totally agree. So would you say that relating to a guest when a guest talks about, like, for example, engineering screw-ups, and by saying, oh, I totally agree with that. We have a segment we do around engineering screw-ups at our conference. Is that too much of like the guest angle, or is that
Oh no,
like
that's
relating?
good.
Okay.
That's good. It'd be like, I tell you about this time I screwed up, and you're like, oh, that reminds me of this time I'm going to spend 10 minutes now talking about the same exact thing that I did, but I'm going to one-up you in some way.
Oh God, one-uppers, that's a problem. I'll say, just like personal opinion, which I sounds like you agree with, anyone who one-ups your stories regularly needs to like reconsider how they are communicating with the world.
You know, since we're talking about this particular topic, which I'm not going to give away yet, it is highly related to your personal self and your thoughts and how you approach, your own interpersonal communications and intrapersonal thoughts.
I mean, we can jump ahead here, honestly. Like, one of the big topics we wanted to talk about is how to diagnose and heal your professional self. It's based off of a lot of incredible advice you give. And I think in part it's based off of your fascinating background. You have a very interesting personal story. You taught yourself how to code when you were 11. You became an entrepreneur. As I mentioned, you've co-founded multiple companies. You built an agency with a globally distributed team. Throughout all of that, you've said that it was actually your degree in social work, your master's in clinical social work, that has been the most useful and impactful degree you could have chosen. And I think a lot of engineers and engineering leaders on, maybe listening to this podcast later may go, that's surprising. So I'd love to understand what's made that so impactful for you and kind of driven this psychological thought process around social work and the relation to coding.
Yeah. So I have my bachelor's in psychology and I have 2 master's degrees in public health and clinical social work. I always thought that I wanted to go into public health, and having taught myself how to code when I was 11, I, for whatever reason, just completely ruled out software engineering as a career. I have a history of saying I'm not going to do something and then doing it anyway, which is why I'm now an engineering leader. But that's beside the fact. I find that when it comes to engineering leadership or software engineering as a whole, we tend to think about what it is that we're building and less about who is actually building the product. Not only who is building the product, but who we're building the product for. At the end of the day, we're building this product for people. We're all different. We all bring different skills. We all have different backgrounds. We all bring different experiences to the table. And I've found that over time, being able to use my degree as a trained therapist has been one of the most impactful things I could have done. I almost considered dropping out of the social work programs. Like, I don't want to be a therapist. This sounds terrible. And I want to make more than 30 grand a year. Literally, it became sort of like a financial decision. But I was like, nah, I can't quit. I'll stick it out. But it turns out that it ended up being way more useful than I thought it would be in terms of establishing rapport with people, whether it's during interviews or while I'm interviewing somebody or I'm being interviewed, dealing with conflict resolution, whether it is a peer, a direct report, or somebody who is above me, like senior leadership. All of these things have just been super, super helpful to know how to approach this. Also, I tend to be able to pick up on whether somebody is approaching burnout before they're approaching it themselves or before they notice it. So that has been a really useful thing because it also has helped me figure out when I'm approaching burnout as well.
I was going to say, I wish I had that skill set sometimes. So that's fantastic. I think there's a real nexus there between the applications in business and your coding and the kind of psychological side, which is that all these deal with people, as you mentioned.
Yes.
We're building tools for people. We're working with other people. So it sounds like that's a common thread that kind of ties this all together for you.
Exactly. When regardless of the career, the field you're in, you're working with people to some degree. People are always going to be involved. Computers are not going to take over our world. Hopefully not. Until that happens, if that happens, we're all going to be involved to some degree in knowing how to think through your own future, your own career, your own troubles that you're experiencing, while also communicating with other people, whether you report to them or they report to you, is always going to be a part of your life.
Do you think that background in social work and the training in psychology has also made you more able to step in other people's shoes and be empathetic?
Without a doubt. Yeah.
And I'll say this is one of the differentiating things that we hear from a lot of leaders, right? Is better emotional intelligence, EQ. It sounds like you think that training has really prepared you to take that into every facet of your career and hopefully personal life, I would assume.
Yes, absolutely. And it's also helped me help others increase their EQ as well.
I'd be fascinated to hear how you approach that.
So you often see, when you're working with engineers, we're engineering podcast, we're going to stick with engineers here. When you're working with engineers at differing levels. So, from junior all the way like staff, into leadership, everyone is on a different level of their journey. And part of that journey is also interpersonal communications. And somebody can have very high EQ, but still be very early on in their career. And I can see the difference in the way that they approach problems, the way that they communicate with people, the way that they're reaching out for help. And as you move more senior, it becomes more and more important as you have people who are looking up to you, people who you are coaching, who are reporting to you, to be increasing your EQ over time, to become more in tune with the needs and feelings and thoughts of others. So this is something that I really focus on when I'm working with my directs or, across whichever company we're talking about. We'll use Spot, for example, since that's where I am. But that's something I really focus on as well, because I can see based on, everyone has a different personality, but some of my engineers are more attuned to the individual and the needs of others and how they aspire to be an engineering manager themselves. And so I play into that and help them apply that to their work, whether they're earlier on and they just need to figure out how they can use that skill to ask for more help or get feedback from others or reach out cross-departmentally so you're not working just within the engineering team. And how you can start to coach others, somebody who's more junior, or somebody who's new to the company who needs to be onboarded, and how you can really bring that positive experience in. So it's something I love to be training early on with all of my engineers, regardless of their goals.
It's interesting because as I apply this lens you're describing of thinking with empathy and trying to help coach others and build community, as I apply that lens to my knowledge of you, and I'll say I've been following you on Twitter for, I don't know, a while. Kelly, for the record, has a very strong Twitter following and deep community she's built with over 100,000 followers. I see that kind of focus on empathy and kind of connection. And I presume that's a major reason why you've also grown that following,
Yeah.
not only in your personal life, but your professional work. If you were going to talk to another engineer or someone who has aspirations to become an engineering leader and say, hey, here are the steps you should take, or here are places you should go to learn and kind of grow that empathy and that EQ, what would you advise them?
I would spend, I'm sure there are definitely books that I'm totally blanking on. Actually, the book I'm going to plug at the end of this, so I'm not going to spoil it quite yet. It's a
Okay.
really, really good one for building EQ.
You have to listen to the end of the episode to hear it.
Now you're stuck. You gotta wait until the very end to get it. Phenomenal book is something I highly recommend to everybody, especially somebody who is thinking about getting into engineering management or who has officially become an engineering manager. They're like, okay, now what? How do I really run with this? Follow people who you see are good examples of that as well. I find those who are more open and authentic about their own lives tend to be more in tune with their emotional intelligence. So, putting a lens of positivity across everything that you do is extremely toxic. And that is something that people who follow me, I'm sure you've seen it many times. How many times I'm very real about like, today sucks. I'm not happy. I'm struggling, because it's a very real thing. And, regardless of how I'm feeling that day, I just want everyone to know, like, I've accomplished a lot in my life at 31 years old, but I still have my bad days. And actually, like, most of this year has been really, really tough for me. But I try to be as open, real, and transparent as possible so people can see like the highs and lows of entrepreneurship, the highs and lows of managing people, because it is, nothing is perfect.
I think that a lot of folks will hear that and say, okay, great. I want to do that in my personal life with my friends and family, but can I really do that in my professional life? Can I really be, as you put it, like open and honest and communicative to that level? Or will it make my coworkers not think I'm weird or think I'm oversharing?
I think there's a balance to what you share. For anyone at Spot who's listening to this podcast, this example I'm going to give is not true. But if I were to tweet, I'm considering quitting my job, that would be a bad thing to tweet. Like, I hate my job. I hate my boss. Like, you're not going to say those kinds of things, Like, there's a balance to what you actually share, to what is considered oversharing, and what is like a reasonable level of like, this situation kind of sucks. Like, this past week has been extra difficult for me. I said, this week has been really difficult for me. I did not share why it was difficult, because it's nobody's business why it was difficult. But it still got across the point where I'm not oversharing, especially since my team internally knows why it was difficult already. But I'm just being very real about the situation. And, I feel like another really important point to take is it does depend on the company's culture. Some companies' culture, is for the companies that are like, tweets do not represent my employer. Some are going to be very more specific about what you can and cannot say on your social media account. And this is just, general rule of social media. If you put it out there, it's out there forever. So use your brain when you're thinking about sharing something. There are certain things I'm not going to share in social media ever, and that's totally okay. And that's actually good.
And I think this comes back maybe to the emotional intelligence piece you mentioned, right? Of great, we can value openness and honesty and communication. And then I'll say, I think those are good cultural values for most organizations to value.
Yeah.
But you also need to know where the lines are and to have the social dynamic understanding it and work to build that with other people, because their lines also may be different. And maybe your VP's line is different than your line. And if so, you need to probably adjust that or else face potential repercussions.
Yeah. It's important to understand your company's culture. What is acceptable, what is not, and what is healthy for you. And honestly, it's one of those things that you want to evaluate when you're considering joining a company, is get a read on I do some research on other people at the company. How are they presenting themselves online? And is it something that makes me comfortable? Is it something that makes me uncomfortable? Do I get excited that they're sharing things that I also like to share? It's very different when I've been an entrepreneur all my life and I can tweet whatever I want because my boss is not going to fire me. When I join a company, suddenly things are different. So I need to be a little bit more in tune with what's happening there.
Yeah. I feel like the phrase cultural fit gets used a ton, both by employers and by potential employees who are evaluating companies.
Yeah.
But we don't talk about like the different pieces of that a lot.
Yeah.
We talk about generalities, and very specifically to your point there around company social culture, social culture. That could be very, yeah. Social culture, social culture could be very important to understanding like, is this place you want to be, particularly if you're someone who's outspoken.
Yes.
And I think this kind of relates to something else I know we want to talk about around the psychology of joining a company, the psychology of a process around that, and the way that impacts the experience of the employee, particularly something you alluded to earlier around burnout. So you mentioned that you are better at identifying the signs of burnout because of that psychology training, because of that social work training, where you're really paying attention to the cues of like, is this person doing okay? Are we taking on too much? And I want to get into the context and particulars of how you go about that.
Yeah.
But I wonder if you're able to see that also from the outside as you're evaluating these companies, maybe to consider joining or seeing like their social presence.
Oh, without a doubt. Yeah. So I think it's important to note there are common signs of burnout, but the much like COVID, the symptoms represent themselves differently from one person to the next.
Mm.
So while some people might get maybe more aggressive or they have like larger mood swings, others will, go deeper within themselves and kind of like hold back. So it's important to recognize that it's not going to be the same for every person, but there are definitely things that you can notice in like behavioral patterns and how they're talking about certain things related to work across social media that could be a red flag or at least like a yellow flag. Like maybe we'll talk about this and like what is the culture like here? What are the values here? And during your interview so you can evaluate that. But yeah, you can definitely pick up on some of those signs. And it's also important to remember you never have the full picture of somebody on social media, especially somebody you do not know. So if you do this research, take it with a grain of salt.
I bet that your background, as we discussed, has helped you recognize many things that all of us kind of have feelings of, because most of us in high growth industries, in high stress, often jobs, have had moments where we felt burned out, maybe have been burned out. And oftentimes there are cultures that make you afraid to call it that or to like really address it. What are the common things that you see people struggle with as they try to express their concerns?
I think it's a very difficult thing to express in general because people see it as a weakness. Something is wrong with me because I am feeling burned out.
Well, they've been told by society that it is a weakness and it's their fault.
Which is a large thing to unpack that requires societal change at a greater level, which unfortunately one person cannot do, but multiple people can help towards the culture shift. But that's a whole topic.
That's another whole podcast. Yeah.
Stay tuned for next week's podcast. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, I think not being heard is another one. Like if you go to, let's say, your boss and you're like, I'm feeling very burned out. Like it was tough for me to even come to tell you this. I'm feeling very burned out. And your boss is like, well, it's just temporary, just work past it. You'll get through it. Or, okay, we'll take the rest of the day off and you'll come back stronger tomorrow. It's important to note that burnout is not like a 24-hour flu. You're not going to get over it immediately. It is something that has built up gradually over time, a number of stressors compacting one on top of the other, which is why you got to the point where you are now. And you're going to have to dig yourself off of that cliff again. And it's going to take time. And not everybody has the luxury of being like, okay, well, I'm going to take 2 weeks off to just like decompress. That is not a realistic thing for a vast majority of people who have bills to pay. So in that respect, from an engineering leadership side, if possible, somebody comes to you like, look, I'm feeling very burned out. I work with them to rework their schedule to figure out what is going to work best for them. And part of that is recognizing how they work. So some people are good at give me, I work very independently. So like, don't bother me, but I'm going to check in on you to see how you're doing, just get a pulse check. We currently have weekly one-on-ones, so let's meet maybe twice or 3 times this week just to see how you're doing. Let's look at the work you're doing. What is stressing you out in particular about this work, if anything? If so, let's see what we can do to alleviate some of that stress. Maybe we'll add another engineer onto this project to help you tag team. Maybe we'll swap projects. Maybe we'll have you focus on something that's a little bit more internal if you're working on something more customer facing that's involving talking with other people where you just aren't in the right mindset to be able to do that at this moment. So there are a number of things that you can do to approach how to, as an engineering leader. I know this is not actually the question that you asked, but it kind of flowed right into it. So here we are. There are a number of things you can do as an engineering leader to help your team through burnout. But I think the most important thing is to have empathy. This is the past 2 years have just been chaotic for everybody. And we're all trying to figure out how to best approach this next step, this next chapter of our lives, this next chapter of, what the world currently looks like. And you really need to be checking in with your teams. Like my one-on-ones, for example, we're not talking about projects unless it just comes up organically. We're talking about how are you doing? Let's talk about you. What's going on? And I think it does also helps that I have the therapy training. So we kind of maybe turn it into a mini therapy session. But if you're not comfortable with that, I totally also understand that you don't want to talk about that and you want to talk about projects. So let's talk about projects. It's not just about catering what that person needs at the present time to help them through their burnout, but recognize that it's not going to happen overnight.
So you mentioned leaders being more empathetic, which I think is a great thing. But I suspect a lot of folks listening to this may go, look, I'm very process oriented. I need to run through my checklists. How do I build empathy? Like we talked a bit about it earlier, but okay, I'm going in a one-on-one. Like what can I do in that one-on-one to make sure I'm being empathetic? Is it, hey, like write down a couple of questions in advance that you make sure you ask every time and actually listen? Is it approach the whole conversation differently? How would you suggest that they go about it?
I think if you're not familiar, or you're not used to kind of bringing in those empathetic questions into your one-on-ones, absolutely write them down. This kind of goes for it's my rule for anything. If you're trying to form a new habit, have it in front of you, write it down, and the more you do it, the more natural it's going to become. If you've been doing one-on-ones a very specific way for your team for a long time, and they're used to a very particular format, give them a heads up that you're going to be switching up the format a little bit. Otherwise, it could be jolting for them to be like, wait, why are you asking me this? So again, it also depends on how your team will respond to those kinds of questions as well. Maybe don't flip the entire format of your one-on-one on its head unless it's truly not working. Then by all means, please fix your one-on-one format.
There's definitely some change management to be done there, especially if you've had the very process oriented, how's this task going? How's this task going?
Exactly.
And I think a lot of folks, when we're talking to them and something I've engaged in before, are also experiencing other problems when they're going into these meetings that maybe are not talking to their manager about. Things like imposter syndrome. Are there strategies that you would advise people, whether they're leaders or, working as developers, to try to address things like imposter syndrome?
I think one of the biggest things that you can do to help address imposter syndrome is validate their concerns, but also validate their past successes as well. Imposter syndrome in a nutshell is I don't feel like I belong here for what I'm not smart enough. I'm not good enough. I don't have the right skills. The team is better than me. Why am I sitting here? Why do people feel like I'm the one who should be delivering this report or building this, whatever it is? It's something you have to practice to get used to helping them overcome imposter syndrome. But one of the biggest things I see is acknowledge how they're feeling and don't just write it off, but let them know, here is why I gave you this project. Here is why I hired you. Here is why you're the team lead. Here is why I'm giving you this opportunity to mentor our intern who's coming in, or to onboard this junior engineer, whatever it might be. Give them the reason why you're making these decisions, as long as the reason's not like, well, I don't know, somebody else told me to do it. Please come up with a better reason than that.
Get up if you have to.
Exactly. Everyone has some level of imposter syndrome, especially when they've joined a new company, they've changed roles, they're getting a new project they're working on, or they're entering into unknown territory. It is if you can walk into a new experience and be like, nah, I got this, like, bravo, I am not you. I am the let's think through this. I got this. I got this. We can figure it out. I'm here for a reason. Giving myself the positive self-talk just to get through whatever it is I'm doing next.
I'll say, I think it's very common. Everyone experiences imposter syndrome at some point. Some people regularly, some people occasionally. And it's also just important to talk about it, that
Yeah.
we all experience it. Like I often will come in and be like, oh, I got this. Like I'm going to take care of it. But it doesn't mean that it's happening all the time. And I often know that I'm in a room and I'm like, what the heck am I doing here? Why did they let me into this meeting?
The
Uh,
number of times I've been on a call, like a sales call when I was still running my company, and I'd be talking to this multi-million dollar business and they'd ask me a question. I'd respond with the perfect answer. And I'm like, how do I know that? Like, where did that come from? I just forget that we've spent so much time getting to where we are. Even if you're at the beginning of your career, at the beginning of your journey as an engineer, your past has brought you to where you are now, and that is something to be celebrated.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of us kind of forget about it because it's just like, oh, of course I lived that, right? Like I already did that. Like, oh, I went to college or I did a boot camp or whatever. Like, yeah, I built that thing, kind of did it. And it's hard in the moment to remember that kind of context for ourselves and apply it and remind your mind, which can be self-destructive sometimes, that, hey, like it's okay. You can move forward. And that's really a form of negative self-talk, I would say,
Without a
which is
doubt.
a whole nother issue.
Yeah. Yeah. Negative self-talk. I mean, and this is something that you also see relating back to burnout. The more you get burned out, the more that negative self-talk starts to come out, especially for people who are generally not that way.
I appreciate that you've brought these psychological concepts to DevOps and to DevOps teams because I think it's something that's not talked about enough. I mean, definitely with imposter syndrome, right? That's
Yeah.
only something that really the last few years I feel like has started to, be publicly discussed.
Yeah. This
But
is just across the line with mental health. Like, it's becoming more and more normalized to just talk about it, and it makes my not practicing therapist heart very happy.
did you practice as a therapist for a while, by the way, or
I had, internships, that was it.
okay, you figured out like, this is not it. I'm gonna finish the degree,
Yeah,
but yeah,
I had some very, very, eye-opening conversations, and I was like, "No, this is not for me."
yeah, fair. Well, it seems like you landed somewhere that's doing great by you. So
Yeah.
digging into the negative self talk piece a little bit more. As an individual, is there advice you have for trying to overcome that or to work around it?
Yeah. Whenever I'm talking to somebody who's kind of experiencing this negative self-talk and I'm seeing a pattern of it, what I usually talk to them about is like, okay, you just said this. Let's break it down. What is leading you to think this? And it could be like a recent event that, I I have definitely never like taken production down myself or deleted a client's site, like
Of
never
course not.
ever. Um and I the negative self-talk kind of spirals from there. I think it's important to sit and understand where this is coming from, and let's work backwards from the source and understand, is this like an external thing that happened? Is it a one-off event that happened, or is this becoming a pattern? And if it's becoming a pattern, well, let's see what we can do to figure out a solution to work around this negative self-talk. I think the one thing that I see like on Instagram happening all the time are like, well, I have this negative statement, so let me pair it with a positive statement. Like, what is the exact opposite of this? And this is what I'm going to start saying, this positive affirmation. This is what we like to call toxic positivity. And that means we're writing off this negative self-talk as if like, well, we absolutely should not be doing this. I instead take the approach like, this is a very real thing to talk about. Like, I could be having a very bad day, and this is why I'm having this negative self-talk. But this is not something that's permanently part of my job. This is just a bad time. And it's temporary, and I will move on. I will get through whatever it is I'm going through. And this is something that I will not have to be worrying about in the future. It's
It's
better to
okay.
do that than like just to cancel out like, oh, I don't need to be doing this. I should be saying this instead.
What I'm hearing is it's okay to experience emotions, including negative ones,
Yes.
but you have to work to not let them control more than the moment or even necessarily the moment.
Yeah. And to add on to this, I think one of the things as an engineering leader that's very important to be in tune with is negative self-talk is something that should be a little bit more of a personal thing. If you start seeing your team bring that negative self-talk into conversations with each other, it's going to bring down morale.
Yeah.
And, you've probably had that one employee who's having a really rough go at things, and other people start commenting like, this person's being really negative about everything that we're doing. And it's bringing my mood down. And when you start to get into that territory, it's time to have that one-on-one conversation with them, to give them that feedback and to work through that feedback with them and figure out the source of that negative self-talk with them, and understand, when this negative feedback or this negative self-talk is brought into a room with multiple people, it is impacting everyone in that room.
Are there other common concerns that will lead to burnout or lead to cultural problems that you see within organizations? I mentioned the imposter syndrome, negative self-talk.
Well, on the opposite side of that, definitely toxic positivity.
Right.
That's a huge one. Your work is not your family unless you literally have a family-owned company. So please don't don't bring that, oh, we're all a family, we're all going to get, like, that's not a healthy view of what we're doing. We need to approach this as we're a team, and we'll work through this. Avoid bringing that toxic positivity into the workplace if you can. I think one of the things that is also important is, as an engineering leader, your team is looking up to you. Your team is watching how you are talking, how you are approaching situations, and how you are thinking through the problems. And, as engineering leaders, we also get imposter syndrome. We also deal with negative self-talk, but they're going to mirror your behaviors. And so it's important to model the behavior you want to see in your team. But that also includes bringing in this situation sucks, and I am right there with you, and we're going to work through this together, as opposed to just ignoring the problem and keeping that internally. So again, everything comes down to like a balance of, what do I share? What do I not share? But remember, your team is watching what you're doing. They're watching what you're saying. They're watching how you approach situations, how you're approaching, certain issues, and they're learning from you. They're looking up to you. And if you want to, build that respect, build that rapport, build that trust and transparency with your team, you're going to have to find that level of what works with them, that allows you to share your real self, your authentic self, while also not just totally shitting on the situation and being like, nothing's ever going to be okay.
And you have to do that self-work too, right? Like, you
Yes.
can't spend all your time trying to address the negative self-talk of an employee and then continuing to do that yourself.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, okay, we're bringing empathy into leadership. We're helping our teams address challenges. We're helping ourselves, deal with challenges and try to improve. That's great. That's important. But what happens when we let that empathy cloud our judgment too far and let's say we hold on to someone for too long? We fall into a sunk cost fallacy mindset.
Ooh, I love talking about this topic.
Great. Yeah.
So for if you're not familiar with the sunk cost fallacy as a whole, the concept of sunk cost fallacy is basically when you're continuing a certain behavior as a result of the resources you've already invested in this behavior in the past. So I think one of the biggest examples we often see is holding on to an employee for too long, as you mentioned, or holding on to a job for too long, or holding on to a company for too long, or, it could be a number of things, a personal project or something you have going on at home. Relationships as a whole is a whole thing to unpack, the sunk cost fallacy, which we're not going
Again, whole other podcast.
Exactly. All that to say, I think it's important as an engineering leader you hopefully have established goals and with each of your employees of what to expect from them. And
I really hope you have.
I really hope you have done this. So we're
If
going to
not,
assume you
we
built
have to
that
go to
network.
episodes for you to listen to here.
Exactly. So knowing what you're expecting from them, you're constantly checking in with them. And this is why these one-on-ones are really important to bring in the personal side of things. Because if you're holding on to an employee not because of their work quality, but because of their, you're not comfortable with letting them go because they're just in a very bad place right now, whatever it might be, whatever that bad place even means, we're not going to define this. I think it's important to watch for trends. If this person is starting to impact the other team, talk to them about it. Put together a plan of, make sure you're giving that constructive criticism. You're giving them that feedback, not during the one-on-one. Has to be a different time because the one-on-ones are sacred times that are not used for giving feedback unless it's specifically asked during that time. So you've scheduled this other call. You're talking to them. You're addressing the situation. You're addressing the behavior, not the person, because we address actions, not people when we give feedback. I can give a whole lesson on giving feedback as well. And if you find that this is a continued behavior, it's not getting better. You've talked to them, and then it gets to the point where you're like, look, this is starting to impact morale as a whole as a team. This is starting to impact the quality of work that's being done. You're going to have to cut ties. And it can be tough. It's your first fire you make is the hardest one you'll ever do. Especially if it's not for, you're not getting your, actually, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Whether it's performance related or behavior related, they're all difficult. But the first one you do is definitely going to be the hardest one you ever do. But you have to recognize when to cut your losses there. Because the worst thing you can have happen is you don't address the situation and then your best performer leaves because they're unhappy with the work environment.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Like, keeping someone around on your team who is a negative for the rest of the team is going to have repercussions beyond just you avoiding a conversation you don't want to have. It's going to impact everyone else's morale and potentially their productivity. And to your point, could lead to other retention issues, people you actually do love having on your team.
Exactly. And I think one real tell of this is you're as you're having these one-on-ones with your team, you're generally in tune with what's happening. But if other team members are bringing the concern to you, it has now become a team-wide problem. Unless it's like specifically a one-on-one issue, which is a different situation, a different conflict you need to address. If it is this is impacting the team, this is impacting the way that I'm able to do my work because it's killing the mood in our team meetings or in our private Slack. Yeah. But we want to avoid that. So you have to have that difficult conversation, and giving feedback and having the difficult conversations, it is a skill. It is a skill you need to practice. It's a skill you need to learn over time. It's something you can learn from others who have more experience. And it's something that you can be coached into doing.
I love this idea of practicing it because I think a lot of folks kind of avoid it instead of saying, okay, let me confront the fact that I need to work on this skill of providing critical feedback and working through what perceived negatives. And I suspect that's something you had to deal with quite a bit in your entrepreneurial career, along with like the sunk cost fallacy more broadly. How does that apply when you're your own boss and you are responsible for leading the entire team that you might have or might not?
Yeah. It then becomes, if you don't have a direct report, lean on your network, lean on your community. I messaged somebody in my network and I was like, look, I think I need to let an employee go. I've never done this before. Can you help me? 15 minutes later, he was on FaceTime with me.
That's awesome.
Walking me through specifically, here's what to say, here's what not to say, here's what you need to write down. So you have a list of like a script basically to read, because then you're getting into HR issues, legal issues, things like that if you've never done it before. Also, please consult an attorney. I think I have to say that, or consult like your HR person if you have one, or if you're using one of those concierge services that gives you access to HR people, please use your network. The last thing you want is a lawsuit.
Absolutely. What about confronting other sunk cost fallacies as an entrepreneur? Let's say you're trying to decide, hey, is this project something I want to continue with? Maybe I built an app and I'm seeing some success. I've been pushing really hard. How do you kind of ask yourself, am I still on the right path?
I think it's a very personal question that you're going to have to ask yourself. And there's no one right answer to be like, yes, this is the time that I need to cut my losses. I've had client projects in the past where I have sorely undercharged for them. Shocking. Nobody's ever done that before in their lives. And it got to the point where we were not making progress on it. It was actually getting like, my mood was bringing down the other people on the team because I was not seeing progress. And and it was only going to impact the client. Thankfully, the client was extremely patient with us. And if we didn't have a good client, it would have been a much worse situation there. But it got to the point where you need to evaluate. It's a numbers game. Am I going to get a return on my investment here? Disregarding what's already happened at this stage, because again, this is the sunk
Again,
cost
avoiding
fallacy we're
sunk cost
talking
fallacy. Yeah.
Yes. If I need to invest more time, more resources, more money into building this thing, am I going to get the return on it? At what point will I get the return on it, if ever? If the answer is I'm not going to get the return on it, that should be your hint that it's time to go. If it might take, like, let's say 6 months to get your return on it, then it becomes a judgment call for you. Is this something you can afford to do? Is this something that's going to make you happy in the long term? Is this something that's just adding more stress to your day, to your life? Are you thinking about it outside of work? If you're still thinking about it outside of work and you're stressing over it, that should be a really strong indicator that maybe this is not the right thing for you.
Well, now I have to confront the fact that I woke up the other week thinking about my OKRs after a dream. So thanks for that.
You're so welcome.
Are there other pitfalls or common mental traps you see entrepreneurs or leaders fall into?
I think one of the biggest ones is the comparison game. We tend to hear everybody's success stories. Rarely do we hear about the stories where they messed up, where they failed. We hear all about these really great entrepreneurs who built a multi-million-dollar business, or maybe as a unicorn at this point. We're disregarding what happened with valuations recently. And you didn't hear about how they had 3 failed startups before then. All you're hearing about is what they currently were able to do successfully. And even if they're earlier on, it's an earlier stage company, maybe it's a bootstrap company, they're figuring things out as they go. If they're not share, people tend to not share the hard times as much as they share the positive times. And it's really easy to compare yourself as a leader, as an entrepreneur, to others who are in that space. When you, again, especially on social media, you do not have the full picture. And let's say everything has gone right for them. Like, this is their first startup and they're now, it's now, let's say, like, in their Series C, and everything's gone beautifully. They've never had to do a round of layoffs. They've never had any churn. Their customer base is going up and to the right. Their revenue is going up and to the right. Everything's beautiful. Congratulations to them. Stop comparing yourself to them. You are 2 different people on 2 different journeys. And
Different
you could be
resources,
exactly.
backgrounds, and experiences.
You could be building the same product as them, the same general idea, but it's never going to be one-to-one the same.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll plug our own episode here. We have an episode of this that I think is really interesting from this perspective. We talked to Drata's CTO. They're a unicorn, the fastest ever unicorn status. And he was really frank with us and talked about, this is like his 8th startup. Most of them have failed. He talked about, like, sending someone a Slack message about firing them accidentally, even though he meant to send it to someone else. Like,
Oh no.
highly recommend this episode if you want to hear from someone who's, like, extremely successful. Daniel Marshalian, their CTO, is one of the best in the business. And I think that's a really important thing, is that vulnerability. And I'm kind of hearing echoes of that from what you're saying, which is that, the best leaders have that vulnerability and bring not only their best self and who they are today, but the experience of what went wrong, and kind of share that and say, hey, I've screwed up. Like, I've been on this journey too. I've had that imposter syndrome. I have made those mistakes. And I think that's how they really differentiate themselves from a lot of points.
Exactly. Yeah. I would rather you learn from my mistakes so you don't repeat them yourself than to paint this picture of this very successful entrepreneur who got tired of entrepreneurship, so she joined the regular workforce, because that is absolutely not my journey.
So is there, like, one piece of advice that you would pass on from your experience as an entrepreneur to other folks listening? That we're talking about a lot of concepts. Is there, like, let's say we want one takeaway for, someone who's a budding entrepreneur or a, budding engineering leader, what would that piece of advice be?
Build your network. Honestly, build a community around you. Entrepreneurship is extremely lonely when you're at the top by yourself. Engineering leadership, the higher up you go, the more lonely it becomes, because the fewer people that you can talk to, the more responsibilities you have, and the more people who are depending on you. So build a network of other engineering leaders or other entrepreneurs who are, on that same journey as you, regardless of whether they're farther ahead or just getting started. It doesn't matter because there's so much you can share from just this is what's happening in my day standpoint that you can't, share with your direct reports, for example. I find that the more that you spend nurturing that network and building those strong connections with others, the easier those difficult times become, because those difficult times will come.
Absolutely. I mean, a couple of ways that I've done it. We've talked a little bit about Twitter, but it's actually incredible some of the connections you'll make if you invest in it and invest in people and community on there.
Yeah.
And more specific to the work we're doing at Dev Interrupted, we do have a Discord community for engineering leaders, people interested in engineering leadership. About 2,400 of you are in there. Thank you all for doing that. And we do weekly conversations, daily conversations. Highly recommend that. I'll also plug that we do have a conference coming up in October for engineering leaders. Kelly's just giving me all the plug opportunities. It's great.
I love it.
Yeah, you register.
It's almost like I've done podcasting before.
You're very good at this. I have to say I appreciate it. devinterrupted.com/interact. It's going to be incredible. We'll have some fantastic guests. We just announced the first one today. James Stanier, Director of Engineering at Shopify, also an author and great speaker. Go check it out, and hopefully we'll see you there. I'd also say there's some great stuff like classes for entrepreneurs or for leaders you can look at. I'm curious if you would have recommendations, Kelly, on classes that entrepreneurs or leaders should look at to kind of like build community, build skills at the same times, and help them like self-diagnose and recognize some of these fallacies or mistakes that are common.
So I took a course on leadership through a local college. That was a 16-week program that you met like once every other week or something. I think it was 8 weeks. That just went through like 8 different types of leadership in situations that you would experience. I would look to see what's available in your local area, what is held by like at a local university, for example. I find those to be very helpful. I do want to make one note on the idea of self-diagnosing issues, workplace issues, leadership issues, how your leadership style is, how you communicate, those types of things. Self-diagnose all day. Anything involving your mental health, please do not self-diagnose.
Great point.
Please see a therapist.
100%. That's great advice. And Kelly, thank you so much for the consistently excellent advice and examples throughout the podcast. It's been a great conversation. We do owe the audience a book recommendation.
Yeah, we do. Don't
so
we?
anyone who stayed listening, we got you now. What's the book recommendation?
The book recommendation is called Crucial Conversations. It's by Stephen R. Covey. I don't know how to say his last
Oh,
name.
yeah.
Yeah. Same 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, same author. Crucial Conversations is such an important book to read, whether you're an engineering leader, whether you're an IC, whether you're just having like you struggle with the interpersonal communication, just in approaching conflict and working through conflict. This book is so incredibly helpful in every single facet of your life. I actually think that they have like classes around this book, but I'm just more of like a read the book and then probably read the book again and tell everybody about it. I had my first viral post on LinkedIn happen. No, my second. The first one was about Elon Musk. We're not going to talk about that one. Weird things that have happened in my past.
Again, it's a whole nother podcast. If we have like 3 spin-offs after this, you'll see
There we go.
later. Yeah.
That book, especially I just want to shout it out since I'm already here. If you're making some kind of transition in your role, whether you're joining a new company, you are changing positions in your role, you have a new boss, you have new direct reports. Every time this happens, it triggers a new professional life event. And yet the clock starts all over again for how can I make the most of this time, these first 90 days of this new role, this new job, this new situation. The book is called The First 90 Days. So really, really solid read. Highly, highly recommend that one.
Amazing. Well, Kelly, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a joy. And I hope to hear you on the Ladybug podcast again soon. Fingers crossed. And worst case, we'll have to have you back because this is a wonderful conversation. I also want to say thank you to everyone who stuck around for this and the 3,000 of you who are now subscribed to our weekly interruption newsletter. You bring me a ton of joy every week with your comments. And we love bringing you articles from the community, inside information on our podcasts, and the first look at Interact 3 on October 25th. If you haven't already been, it's a wonderful experience for engineering leaders, and you can register at the link in the episode notes. And we'll have links to the books that Kelly recommended and much more as well. And we'll see you next week. Kelly, thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much.